If we consider what is the single most important technology, the single most important competency for a 10x improvement in well-being, it's the technology of identity. Now, an identity begins with the I. That's the paradigm of the distinct self. Without that paradigm, we are an interconnected whole, an interconnected ecology. And whether or not we hold the paradigm of the distinct self dissolves, dies, cannot exist in a whole host of ways without the continual cooperation of the ecology for air, for temperature, for space, for time. And so we are, in fact, interconnected. The riddle of identity, because we have the I, the distinct self, and the dentity, the frequency of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. So each of these dimensions of selfhood, of an identity, is a pattern. It's a frequency. And the reality that we generate emerges out of this frequency. Human beings are currently the most influential identities on the planet, the single most significant pattern of engagement that's having a very large impact on not only our own life, but that of the planet. Now, there's a symbiotic relationship between ecology and identity, because the ecology creates the identity, and the identity creates the ecology. It's a feedback loop. And most importantly, it's a sustainable feedback loop. For anyone to be more than a few hours old means that the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is successful enough at surviving in the current ecology, the current financial ecology, social ecology, physical, mental, emotional ecology. It's adequate. But to get a 10 times better life begins with a 10 times more intelligent identity, a 10 times more intelligent pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And in order to go from this pattern over to this pattern, in order to make the transition from this identity to this identity, one has to dissolve the pattern, which means the current identity has to lose coherence. So you dissolve the mental pattern, you dissolve with it the emotional pattern, you stop the behavior that was emerging out of that thought and feeling. You change and delete the words that were coming out of that prior identity. And in time, a new way of being. Your body will be affected somewhat. Take an identity of not running to an identity of running. It will show up in your body over time. The identity of eating pancakes to the identity of eating broccoli. It will show up in your being, in your presence, in your body over time. Now, the most vulnerable part of a shift in identity, a shift in the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, is this middle part here. This bit is the unknown. This bit is chaos. This bit is uncertainty. This bit is change. This whole passage from one identity to another identity is incredibly vulnerable, because in the space of the void, in the absence of integration and formation, in the dissolution of order, you have the largest possibility field that you will ever encounter. The unknown is vastly bigger than the known. It has to be, because we're using a human reference point. So what we don't know is 1,000 times bigger than what we know. We don't even know 1/1,000,000th of what there is to know on this planet alone, let alone the rest of the galaxy or the billion life-affirming or life-capable planets that we know of so far and counting. We know so little that we don't know most of what we don't know. It's just too big for us to have mentally digested the fact that we didn't know this or this or this or this. There's just so many unknowns. So when you delete a current pattern, that has a probability field that's relatively familiar. When we delete the known pattern with its known probability field, we enter the largest possibility field that we will ever experience. We go through the unknown, the chaos, the unknown, as we move towards a new identity. Now, it's this mid-terrain that is so terrifying for so many people, because when you're traumatized, which is one way of shattering identity, because, when you have your pattern over here and it diverges from the giants around you, when a 2-ton giant, 30 feet tall, figuratively speaking, relative to the mass of an infant, of a child, tells you you better do this or you're going to go to hell, tells you that you're a piece of shit, tells you that you're unwanted and will have to fend for yourself. Whatever the message is of trauma, whether it's a bully, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher humiliating you in front of a class, when your pattern collapses under the influence of superior mass, you enter the helpless state of trauma, the helpless, lonely, separate state of being helpless, uncertain, undefined, in the void. I don't know who I am. Who I wanted to be has been shattered with a traumatic impact with something much bigger than me. And we're in the void. We're in this deep, deep pain of loneliness and sadness and smallness. And it becomes, in a certain way, a self-referential loop where the new identity can emerge in the trauma. The new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is that of a trauma survivor, re-experiencing and being terrified of trauma. So this becomes the new pattern, the traumatic identity. And having lost often something innocent and beautiful with superior mass losing the original pattern, having it knocked out and knocked out. There's a grief around that. There's also the fear of reestablishing identity and having it knocked out again by the same superior force, the same dynamic. But there's also the tremendous awareness and resistance to ever going into the void again, because the traumatic identity that formed, the tightness, the smallness, the grief, the loneliness, was one of the most miserable identities that we'd experienced. We lost innocence, and it was replaced with shame, with misery, with helplessness, with bitterness that had to be repressed to avoid further abuse, suppression, secrecy. And anyone who's occupied the identity of the cult wound has a common and healthy response, which is, I don't like this. I never want to feel this way again. And so then we claw ourselves out and we form some new identity. Hopefully get out of the abusive dynamic. We form a new identity. And it's like grabbing a lifeboat. We've got a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. It's away from the traumatic abuse, and I never want to go into that void, the vulnerability of that chaos, which is the feminine principle, the great unknown, the chaos, the void, space, the unknown. It's the largest possibility field. It's where we're completely out of control. And we use the identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that we've learned to improve our life incrementally, step by step. We build and refine and polish the identity. And then comes this idea of a 10x life, which means really beginning with a 10x identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that's 1,000% more intelligent than the current pattern. It is the single most radical technology on the planet. So trauma knocks us out of our identity through violation. It's an out-of-control, violent, and unattuned force that shatters the existing identity and leaves us in the void without the technology to really get out. So we just flail around in there and find some kind of an identity, often bonding to the very pain and the worst memories of our lives. It's called PTSD. And we hold on to the PTSD and the memory and the memory and the memory of the pain because that repetitive little loop stops us from experiencing the vastness, the dissolution of the void, the loss of the ego, the loss of identity in that void. And so whatever we cling to go round and round, it's holding on to the I in the pattern and putting up a protection against the void. So to make the transition from point A pattern to point B pattern involves going through the unknown, involves losing control. Because every pattern enters a state of chaos and unknown as it moves to a new pattern. And there's always a better pattern. This is why it's the most potent technology. It's the most powerful technology. I mean, the various patterns that we embody and identify with and create futures out of is the most powerful technology. And yet, every single technology exists on a bell curve of innovation. At the tail end is mediocrity, and at the other end is bleeding edge, leading new technology and innovation. And at the middle is the status quo, the average, Well, every single identity, whether it's a cultural identity, a family identity, or a personal identity, can be radically iterated, evolved into something radically more intelligent. And the amount of trauma versus grace and joy and excitement we experience as we make the transition from something mediocre to something more beautiful, that pattern it's a pattern that when it's within our control, when we know where we're going, it's the most exciting thing we could possibly imagine, to recreate our identity by simply identifying with a different pattern, a more intelligent pattern. And there's always, all patterns are refracted out of the sphere. And as soon as they are refracted, they are imperfect. They lack perfect symmetry. As soon as they're into thought, they're into language. The perfection is shattered, but consciousness is born. And as an imperfect heuristic model of reality, it can be improved, it can evolve, or it can deteriorate. And the direction of intelligence is towards complexity. And just to understand that little bit there, if you take the one, the circle, and you refract it into 4, now you've got, if it's an equal 4, you've got a square. Put that square tire onto a car and it's very bumpy. If you iterate the square into an 8-sided point and put that on the car, it's half as bumpy. And the more complex your model for engaging and dealing with reality is, the more graceful it is, the more like a sphere it appears and returns to. And as you move through life in the spiral dance of flow, the more complex your system is, the more graceful it is. And so systems, whether they're identities or anything else, evolve moving towards complexity, moving towards balance, moving towards grace, moving towards awareness if that complexity is introduced into language, until you transcend the shape and get enough of a glimpse of the one to vacate the system. You went into the system at a very crude level, you refined the system, then you let the system go as you return to the transcendent brain, the transcendent consciousness of reconnecting, re-identifying with the larger ecology that gave birth to us. So that's the direction of identity, and it correlates with the direction of intelligence, which is measured by the efficiency with which time, money, and natural resources is transformed into sustainable human well-being. So there's always a better identity. And the more cult-like your culture is, the easier it is to iterate it, because you're highly regressed and ripe for evolution in a highly cult-like cult. The more there's the chur part of the culture, the more there's that flow and organic intelligence and response and adaptation, then the less opportunity there is to evolve. Since everything is always evolving, all reality, if we look at, the Big Bang in 24 billion years ago and look at what's going on today, the universe is more complex, bigger, there's more time. There wasn't any time 24 billion years ago. It was all in this little energy. Now there's billions of light years. So life has been creating more time, more space, more distinctions, and more relationships than ever before, and is doing more and more of that. So that's one thing life's doing. The other thing that life is doing is seeing which of those patterns of relating are more sustainable relative to others. And the sustainable, the efficient patterns of relating are succeeding and consuming and absorbing those aspects of life that are less efficient. And this is intelligent. No energy is created or destroyed. It simply moves from one shape to another as it evolves in an intelligent direction. You can see that, in the paradigm of the evolution of species. We are a more sophisticated pattern today than was on the planet 100 million years ago, 200 million years ago, 500 million years ago. So life is iterating towards complexity. And as it does, that complexity can bog down into inefficiency and bureaucracy, as in more and more destructive bogging down protocols, or it can move into more and more efficient forms of complexity, leading to more sustainable win-win relationships between energies. Because obviously, if you have a symbiotic partnership with 5 or 6 other highly intelligent, competent patterns of energy, your odds of survival, security, love and belonging, the whole hierarchy of human needs go dramatically up than if it's just you. In part because of the law of mass, which in a sociopathic paradigm, says that the larger the object, whether it's through gravity or collision, the larger objects change the pattern of the smaller objects that they collide with. If an asteroid bangs into the Earth doesn't change orbit, the asteroid does, because the Earth is so much bigger. And so there is a dynamic of the law of mass, that relates to this. So our number one goal is to develop the technology of changing our identity. So we've got, for example, self-image is one paradigm into changing identity. Habits, changing a habit, another paradigm into the technology of changing identity. And for an identity to change, you have to loosen your attachment to who you've been and who you are, so to the past. And so you have to loosen that, and you have to liquefy it in some way. And at this point, you are like molten lead. If you heat up molten lead or molten gold, both relatively soft metals, so it doesn't take that much to heat them into a liquid state. Now, you might have a beautiful Buddha made of gold, and you put it into the furnace, and you liquefy the gold. Now, one of two things will happen. For that gold to be useful, it now needs to go into a new mold, a new pattern. Now, if you put it into a new Buddha sculpture that's more beautiful, that has a more sincere smile or whatever, then you're iterating the old form through a process of liquefaction. But you could also cast it into a blob, which nobody could relate to. You just pour it on the sand. And this is why transitioning identity is such a vulnerable thing, is there's not a guarantee that when you melt down the existing structure, because you've got to melt the structure, you've got to heat it up to a point where it liquefies. There's no guarantee that what recoagulates, what reforms, will be more symmetrical or more intelligent than what was liquefied. You have a guarantee of difference, but it may not be moving in the direction of grace and intelligence. If you go from being, progressing at 10% per year on an evolutionary metric to losing your mind and staying frozen in time, the fact that it could have been magnificent is true, but it didn't turn out that way. It's created a chaotic mess. And so, you have the full range because possibility goes out in all directions. It can be better, a lot worse, depending on your skill at navigating the chaos and possibility field. So what are some of the liquefaction technologies that we know about? So one of them is changing your daily routine. So we'll kind of, these are the processes for liquefying A. So we have changing the daily routine. It's liquefying your actions, and then your thoughts, feelings, and bodies will change. You've also got falling in love, because if you fall deeply in love, then there is a third energy created, the possibility field of the relationship. And in that possibility field, there is tremendous beauty. There's a tremendous beauty in that possibility field. And if you allow yourself to be recreated and invest in that beauty, then you will let go of things that you were attached with. Like, I never let anyone in my room. But you, the one that I'm falling in love, come into my room. So you're liquefying a boundary. I don't let anyone touch me, but you, who I love, I let you touch me. I'm liquefying boundaries. So falling in love. Travel is another important liquefaction technology, because here I am, I'm being a proper business person, I'm I'm leaving my personal life at home, I'm doing all the proper things of a business person in my cult. But then I travel abroad and people are wearing colorful clothes and my business suit seems weird and uncomfortable and people are giving warm hugs and blessings. And suddenly my protocol of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is out of place. And the environment over time always trumps the ego, the identity. The environment over time, the ecology, in other words, the cult, over time, has more influence on the person than the person has on the cult. Why? Because it's bigger. The cult will deal with all the backlash and defense and say, why are they eating grasshoppers and what are, nobody said this and I'm not going to do that and that's crazy. You can say that. And the cult smiles and carries on doing what it's doing. And you resist and explain to another person how crazy they are and they smile, having happily lived their life the way they're living it for hundreds of years and watching their ancestors and all that. And they say, oh, well, you'll figure it out one of these days. And so you gradually wear it down. And, in order to survive, to feel secure, to have love and belonging and integrate with a cult, you stop sticking out as a sore thumb and you adapt to the cult, to the ecology that you're in. And the same with natural ecology. If you go to the North Pole from Hawaii and you keep the same identity with your Hawaiian t-shirt, you'll be dead within an hour. And so probably within 5 minutes, you're relinquishing the dress identity, the dress pattern, in order to adopt one that will allow you to survive and not feel so cold. And so the more traumatic, the more threat there is in the identity, the more rapidly anyone intelligent will adopt. And so the cult is always, the ecology is always, the environment is always ultimately more powerful than a lone identity. And yet, it is the minority identities that are the most intelligent. And so there's this tension between the law of mass and the law of intelligence. The law of mass, the bigger energy will change the smaller energy more than the smaller energy will change the bigger energy. The law of intelligence says that the earliest adopters of a new technology are always a very tiny minority. So the law of intelligence says that if you want to find the most intelligent people anywhere in a group, you have to find a minority of less than 2% of the people. And within that minority of less than 2% of the people, you will find not only the crackpots and all of that, but you'll also find the geniuses, the innovators that are doing stuff that you don't even know you don't know, but that once you realize what you don't know and understand the paradigm, you start to see some of the possibilities and get excited about it. These are not laggards, these are visionaries. And so you got to look at the minority. And so you understand then that the most intelligent people with the best identities for competency are in less than 2% of the people, but that all minorities are swept along in any collision with the majority. The minorities are often wiped out, and it's one of the reasons why the most intelligent cults on the planet, the most intelligent cults that can exist and have ever existed, are cults that show great reverence for their minorities and make an effort to sort their minorities into the two piles of, crazy, insane, dysfunctional laggards and brilliant genius and visionaries. If you understand they're both going to be in that 2%, and that the most intelligent cult that could exist is a cult that uses a protocol to rapidly sort the minorities into two groups, number one, and then switch, because the cult has the power to imprison, like the Catholics had the power to kill Galileo, to excommunicate him, to terrorize him, to make his life miserable. They had the power. But they also had the power, the majority also has the power with competent leadership to elevate and learn from its minorities. They also have the power to say, we could kill our future and the future of our species by murdering socially, financially, physically, by murdering, by humiliating, by ostracizing, by starving the most competent minorities in our midst. Or we can leapfrog our cult into a cult that we don't even know we want yet, but that we do once we realize it, that is held in the mind state of a minority. We could bow to the minority, having sorted effectively and said, hey, here's $1 billion of global funds. Show us how to use this to dramatically improve the species' well-being. It's only $1 billion. And so you can afford to be wrong. You can also, be humble to the fact that even pioneers and geniuses make lots of mistakes. So you could say, do 10 experiments with 100 million each and give them to 10 minorities and see who can deliver the most sustainable well-being for the cult through iterating, through being given the lead. This is the journey of evolution. I could dominate you. You see, it's the same protocol with the parent. When the parent learns from the innocence of the infant and restructures their life to sustain what is beautiful, true, and good in their child, rather than sacrificing their child's innocence to the industrial machine that dissects and rips apart the psyche and the body of its people in order to feed the machine of the factory, of the cult, of the capitalist paradigm, the machine that one generation after another is fed into, cutting off tips of fingers, mangling legs, printing an organic body part into a rigid and ossified dogma. When a parent refuses to give their child to the chopping block of the cult, when the parent fights the cult and serves their child, the parent evolves. When the parent sacrifices their child to the cult, to the demon, to the dragon, then the innocence in the parent is lost along with the innocence of the child. The ability to feel and attune is numbed and lost along with that of the child. And the cult remains in the dark ages of the reptilian brain, induced by the intergenerational sacrifice of transcendence of its most vulnerable minorities, but also the minority that is closest to transcendence, that is closest to the one just freshly emerged out of the chaos, out of the possibility field, into a newly forming identity. When that identity is served as a choice, as the mature choice of an adult, you rapidly accelerate the growth of the species, the growth of the cult. Now, another liquefaction protocol is psychedelics, mind-altering substances. You have a range there: ayahuasca, peyote, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, marijuana, mind-altering substances that induce high emotional states. High emotional states and the temporary suppression of the default mode network of the brain that maintains the identity. That is, one of the expertise of psilocybin or LSD, to shut down the default mode network long enough for a new pattern to emerge. And in this process, for a new pattern to emerge in this process, again, you will have a liquefaction. And out of that liquefaction, you will recrystallize into a new identity. Now, psychedelics can take you into the future because they can physiologically induce states of physiology that would normally only be induced in a more competent, more empathic culture. It's kind of like a tomato plant that's out in the cold being brought into a hot house, where it'll grow rapidly for a series of 10 hours and then get put back out in the cold again. And that's part of the crisis of psychedelics or travel or falling in love, is heating up and then crashing, generating a greenhouse through traveling to another country, doing a workshop, doing an intense therapy session, doing a psychedelic session, falling deeply in love, and beginning to blossom. It's like a tomato plant doesn't open its bloom until the temperature is warm enough. But with these rapid accelerants, you can increase the temperature synthetically and rapidly by moving, etc. And then what emerges and grows into that dynamic is then frozen. The bloom opens, and before it can fruit and crystallize into an identity, the therapy session is over. The drug wears off. You return from your trip. Your lover leaves and goes back home after her vacation. And that budding process of opening into a new identity is met with a blast of cold air, and the flower withers. And with it, the identity. And then there's a sense of loss, the sense of grief. I have lost the known sense of self. I have lost my sense of identity. And now I don't know who I am. I don't know where to go. I don't know how to choose a better identity. I can't go back to the way it was before. I don't know how to do that. Again, the great vulnerability and why so many people respond to this crisis, not by learning the technology of relationship, that would be competent, but avoiding depth of relationship altogether. I fell in love once. The identity was truncated and aborted. It felt absolutely horrible. And I never want to feel that way again. I didn't feel that way until I fell in love, so I'm just not going to fall in love. I'll enjoy sex, I will enjoy pornography, but I will not allow my identity to open and liquefy again, only to be frozen in mid-bloom with the dissociative behavior of a sociopath who is unconscious of any of these dynamics in a traumatically and psychologically illiterate cult in which, if anything, one is taught about independence, not about the interdependence of an identity, and the fact that it takes two to say yes and form a third energy, and only one to walk away and leave the greenhouse door open as all the orchids freeze in the outer cult of the Alaskan winter. And so this is the most potent and powerful technology of evolution and change that there is, moving from one identity to a more intelligent identity. These are some of the agents of liquefaction and change. Intensity is another, whether it's through sleep deprivation, chanting for 3 days running, dancing all day and dancing all night, doing a great feat, doing something that takes us to the edge of the known pattern of identity, regardless of how that heat is generated, in that there are times and spaces that are relatively liquid in which we can easily and fully become a different person. And the life that we create for ourselves, our ecology, and others is and can be forever changed. All knowledge begins with a paradigm, and out of that paradigm comes an idea, an awareness that we adopt, reject, or synthesize into something better. It doesn't become wisdom, it doesn't become useful until we take action, until we integrate it into not only our thoughts, but our feelings, our body, our words, and our way of being. For that to occur, we have to move from the passive media paradigm into more active engagement. In the link below, in the More Information section, is an invitation to join a very small, deliberately filtered, high-quality discussion with a group of people who share a common language and want to work with these ideas, with me and with one another, with the sole goal of creating 10 times more sustainable well-being for ourselves and those around us per unit of energy invested. Thank you for watching.